Welcome to this week's episode of Stranger Stitches, where we weave together yarn and yarns about the darkest threads in crime and history. Fair warning, Shug, this ain't your grandma's sewing circle. We're rated at least PG for salty language and unsavory content, and that's all the warning you get. Think of us as just neighbors on the front porch sipping sweet tea and swapping stories that'll make your stitches drop and send shivers down your spine. So, sit yourself down, grab up your favorite project, and buckle up, Buttercup. Nothing says relaxing hobby time like discussing crime scenes and crochet. Truth really is stranger than fiction, and we're here to prove it, one stitch at a time. Today I have for your consideration the story of Robert the Doll. Yeah, this story has got more documented victims than some serial killers. When you're staring at Robert the Doll in his glass case at Fort East Martello Museum, surrounded by over 1,000 desperate apology letters from people whose lives got systematically destroyed after showing him some disrespect, you start to realize this ain't your typical tourist attraction. This is a 4-foot tyrant in a sailor suit who's been running a century-long campaign of targeted revenge, and the evidence is plastered all over his exhibit walls. Robert's documented reign of terror, and let me tell you, the stories run the gamut from heartbreaking to horrifying, so damn bizarre you'd think someone was making it up. But the thing is, these aren't campfire tales or urban legends passed down through generations. These are sworn testimonials from real people whose cars crashed, marriages ended, and jobs disappeared right after they mocked the doll. And that makes them worth examining, because if there's one thing that'll teach you about the darker corners of human experience, it's a cursed object with a paper trail. Now, Robert's origin story reads like something straight out of a horror novel, but the details are too specific and the consequences too real to dismiss. Back in 1904, young Robert Eugene, or Gene Otto, he went by Gene, received what would become the most malevolent birthday gift in recorded history. The official story says his grandfather picked up the doll from the Steve Company in Germany. You know, that's the ones that make them real cute teddy bears. But the version that actually explains the century of chaos that followed, well, that's one about the Bahamian servant who knew her way around voodoo and black magic. She crafted a vessel for her vengeance. The doll she created wasn't just stuffed with straw. It was stuffed with malevolent intent, a walking, talking curse designed to make the Otto family's life a living nightmare, and damned if it didn't work. Exactly as advertised. Robert stands about 4 feet tall, which is already creepy enough for a child's toy. But it's his face that really gets you. Those black, beady eyes aren't the warm, inviting eyes of a beloved plaything. They're cold, calculating, of something that's been watching and waiting for over 100 years. His face is pockmarked and scarred, like ritual markings carved into flesh, except this flesh is fabric and straw. He's dressed up in what was probably one of Gene's own little sailor suits, and he clutches a small toy dog in his lap because apparently even cursed dolls need emotional support animals. The physical description matters because it establishes something crucial. This wasn't designed to be cuddly. From day one, Robert looked exactly like what it was, a conduit from something dark and vengeful. The moment Robert entered the Otto household, normal childhood ended and something far more sinister began. Gene didn't just play with his new doll. He formed what can only be described as an unholy alliance with whatever entity had taken up residence in that straw-filled body. And the evidence of Robert's malevolent conscience weren't subtle. It was loud, destructive, and absolutely terrifying. Gene's parents could hear him having conversations in his room, which wasn't unusual for a kid with an active imagination. What was unusual was hearing 2 distinct voices. Gene's high, childish tone was something else entirely, something deeper, gruffer, more adult. When they'd creep closer and listen, they'd hear full conversations between their son and this unknown entity, back and forth exchanges that went on for hours. Okay, pump the brakes. Hang on for just a second. You've got a small child seeming to have an adult conversation in their bedroom, and you just sit there and listen? I don't think so. I'm going in. I'm seeing what's going on, seeing who's there, maybe taking a shift in the nursery myself for all I know. But I digress. Thank you for sticking with me. Well, Robert wasn't content to just chat. He had a flair for the dramatic and a taste for destruction that would make a poltergeist jealous. Furniture would be overturned, belongings smashed, rooms destroyed, and when Jean's parents would confront him about the chaos, the boy would deliver that line that would become infamous throughout Key West. Robert did it. Now, y'all might think this is just a little kid being clever and trying to deflect the blame onto his toy, but the evidence suggests otherwise. On multiple occasions, Jean's parents would burst into the room, just like I was saying I would do, and find it completely trashed while their son cowered on his bed, genuinely terrified. If Jean was the one causing the destruction, why would he be afraid? The logical conclusion is that something else had been doing the wrecking and that Jean was just as much a victim as everyone else. The servants sure as hell believed Robert was responsible. They'd quit without notice rather than spend another day in that house, claiming they were scared out of their wits. These weren't just superstitious folks looking for an excuse to leave a difficult job. These were experienced household staff who would rather face unemployment than whatever was happening in the Otto household. Then there's the case of the visiting aunt, which really drives home Robert's zero-tolerance policy for disrespect. This woman was fed the fuck up with the chaos and convinced the doll was the source of the family's problems. She banished Robert upstairs to the attic. She died that night. Not weeks later, not months later, but on that same night, the message was clear. Challenge Robert's authority and you will pay the ultimate price. Even locked away in the attic, Robert made his presence known. The family would hear giggling coming from the empty space above them, along with the distinct sound of something moving around up there. It wasn't just the settling of an old house or mice in the walls. This was a deliberate, purposeful movement that seemed designed to remind everyone that Robert was still there, still watching, and still very much in control. Now, one might think that growing up might have broken whatever hold Robert had over Jean Otto, but you'd be dead wrong. If anything, the doll's influence grew stronger as Jean entered adulthood, creating a toxic dynamic that would poison his marriage and turn his home into a battleground between his wife and his supernatural companion. Jean brought Robert into his marriage like some people bring emotional baggage, except this baggage could move around the house on its own and had documented history of destroying lives. His wife, Annette, was understandably disturbed by the doll, but her attempts to deal with the situation only made things worse. Annette would lock Robert away in the attic, again in the attic, only to find him sitting in the living room the next day. She'd put him in a closet. He'd reappear in the kitchen. Jean swore he never moved the doll, which left Annette with the impossible position of either accepting that the doll was teleporting around her house or believing that her husband was gaslighting her. Either option was enough to drive someone over the edge. The psychological warfare wasn't just limited to the Otto family. Neighbors and visitors provided independent corroboration of Robert's activities, which is crucial because it eliminates the possibility that all of this was some elaborate family delusion. Local school children were terrified of what they called the artist house, swearing they could see Robert moving from one side of his upstairs window to the other, as if he were watching them. Visitors to the home reported hearing, I can't speak today, I'm sorry. Visitors to the home reported hearing eerie giggles and footsteps coming from locked rooms where Robert was supposedly confined. But perhaps the most unsettling testimony came from people who witnessed Robert's facial expressions change in real time. They'd be having a conversation and suddenly Robert's inanimate features would shift, his expression becoming more aware, more engaged, as if he was not just listening but actively participating in what was being said. Corey Convertito, the current curator at the Fort East Martello Museum, has studied the case extensively and offers us a chilling assessment of Jean's relationship with Robert. What people really remember is what they could probably term as an unhealthy relationship with the doll. He brought it with him everywhere. He talked about it in the first person as if it weren't a doll. He was Robert, as if he were a live entity. This wasn't a man who owned a doll, but he was owned by the doll. When Jean Otto passed away in 1974, you might have expected Robert's reign of terror to end with him. After all, if the doll's power was somehow tied to Jean's psychological state or childhood trauma, his death would have broken the spell. But Robert had other plans, and his next victims would prove that the curse was tied to the object itself and not to any particular owner. Myrtle Router purchased the artist house and discovered Robert in the attic, where he'd been waiting like a spider in his web. Her young daughter was initially delighted to find the doll, but that delight quickly turned into absolute terror. The child began screaming at night, claiming that Robert was moving around her room and threatening to hurt her. This wasn't the imagination of a child who'd heard scary stories about the doll. She hadn't heard anything. This was a kid who was genuinely afraid for her life. For 20 years, Myrtle lived with Robert's antics. Why so long, I don't know. Experiencing the same phenomena that had plagued the Ottos, unexplained footsteps, eerie giggling, the doll's uncanny ability to appear in different locations throughout the house, but there was a new wrinkle to Robert's behavior that revealed something important about his nature. Visitors noticed that Robert's expression would visibly change if anyone spoke ill of Jean Otto, suggesting a lingering loyalty to his original owner that transcended death. This detail is crucial because it demonstrates that Robert isn't just a malevolent entity, it's a malevolent entity with a memory, emotion, and capacity for both loyalty and revenge. It's not a random lashing out. He's making calculated decisions about who deserves his protection and who deserves his wrath. By 1994, Myrtle had had enough. She donated Robert to the Fort East Martello Museum, probably thinking that she'd finally be free of the curse. Well, what she actually did was give Robert a much larger audience to terrorize, transforming him from a private menace into a public threat with global reach. Robert's arrival at the Fort East Martello Museum marked the beginning of the most well-documented phase of his supernatural career. No longer confined to terrorizing individual families or people, Robert now had access to thousands of visitors from around the world, and he made the most of the opportunity. The museum staff quickly learned that Robert wasn't just an exhibit. He was an active participant in his own display with very specific rules about how he expected to be treated. The protocol for visiting Robert is more like a diplomatic ceremony than a museum experience. Visitors must politely greet Robert upon entering his exhibit, maintain respectful behavior at all times, ask permission before taking photographs, and thank him before leaving. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements, and the consequence for breaking them are swift, severe, and thoroughly documented. The walls around Robert's exhibit are covered with over 1,000 letters from people whose lives were systematically destroyed after showing him some disrespect. These aren't vague complaints about bad luck. They are detailed accounts of specific targeted misfortunes that began immediately after violating any of Robert's rules. Take this case. The case of the disrespectful friend, documented on Reddit by someone whose friend's sister, a little ways down the line, but she made the mistake of flipping Robert off and taking his photo without permission. The consequences were immediate and escalating: terrible luck, corrupted photos, and the constant feeling of being watched. Her life only returned to normal after she mailed a formal letter of apology to the doll, which suggests that Robert only punishes those who disrespect him, but he's also capable of accepting genuine contrition. Now, this excerpt, for me, takes a great big grain of salt. There was the skeptical family, who demonstrates Robert's ability to strike preemptively. Again, I say big grain of salt. Before they even arrived in Key West, the skeptical brothers suffered a plumbing backup that cost nearly $4,000. So it seems that Robert is firing a warning shot across the bow. During their visit, he sarcastically thanked Robert upon leaving, which triggered a cascade of disasters. Another plumbing backup at their rental property. The narrator loses their job, and the brothers' marriage ended within 6 months. And I'm going to leave that right there. Do with that what you will. The letter from Eric D. illustrates the seemingly random yet targeted nature of Robert's revenge. After taking a photo without permission, Eric experienced a series of escalating misfortunes that seemed designed to get his attention and force him to acknowledge Robert's power. The fact that these incidents stopped after he wrote his apology letter suggests that Robert's goal isn't just causing suffering, it is to be recognized and respected. Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from Kathy C., who connected with a sudden and severe illness directly to Perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from Kathy C., who contracted a sudden severe illness directly related to the moment of disrespect towards Robert. Her letter reads like a medical case study, detailing specific symptoms and their timeline in relation to her museum visit. The precision and correlation between her disrespectful behavior and her subsequent illness is too exacting to be coincidental. The museum receives up to 3 apology letters per day, creating a grim daily ritual where staff members are required to read each new letter aloud in Robert's presence. This isn't just customer service, it's appeasement, a desperate attempt to pacify an entity whose wrath has gone global and whose memory is apparently infinite. Now, before you dismiss all this as mass hysteria or the power of suggestion, consider the consistency and specificity of the reports. We're not talking about vague feelings of unease or minor inconveniences that could be attributed to confirmation biases. We're talking about documented patterns of major life disruptions, car accidents, job losses, illness, divorce, that began immediately after specific interactions with Robert and end only after the formal apologies are made. The psychological mechanism at work here might be more complex than simple belief in a curse. Robert represents something primal and terrifying, the idea that our actions have consequences we can't control or predict. That disrespect towards an unknown can result in very real punishment. Whether you believe in supernatural forces or not, the documented pattern of misfortune following disrespect is undeniable. There's also the question of why Robert's power seems to be growing rather than diminishing over time. It's probably because he's drawing on a larger audience now. In an age of scientific skepticism and rational thinking, you'd be expected to believe in, the cursed object's power would fade, but instead, Robert's influence appears to be expanding with the new victims added to his roster every day. This suggests that whatever forces animates Robert isn't dependent on widespread belief. It's operating according to its own rules and its own agenda. The museum's role in this phenomena is particularly interesting. By creating a formal protocol for interacting with Robert and maintaining an archive of his victims' testimonials, they've essentially institutionalized his power. They've transformed a folk belief into a documented system with clear rules, consequences, and procedures for redemption. In doing so, they've given Robert something he never had before: official recognition and legitimacy. Robert's transition into the digital age has been seamless and terrifying. Social media has amplified his reach exponentially, and with photos and videos of him spreading across platforms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. But here's the thing. Even digital disrespect seems to trigger the wrath. People who mock him online, share his image without permission, or make jokes about his appearance report the same patterns of misfortune as those who disrespected him in person. The digital dimension of Robert's power raises fascinating questions about the nature of supernatural influence in a modern world. If Robert's curse can be transmitted through photographs and videos, what does that say about the relationship between physical objects and digital representations? Are we dealing with an entity that has adapted to the new forms of media, or has his power always been capable of transcending physical boundaries? The Reddit communities dedicated to Robert are particularly revealing. Users share their experience with a mixture of fascination and genuine fear, creating a global support network of Robert's victims. These forums serve both as warning system and confession booths, where people can admit their mistakes and seek advice on how to make amends. Seems as simple as writing a letter, but as big as you think, okay. Stop. This is just from me for a second. You would think that with the exposure that Robert's getting, they would be nipples deep in a pool of correspondence by now, just dealing with Robert. But apparently that's not the case. And maybe I'm taking a curse on myself by speaking this way about Robert, but I guess only time will tell. The fact that these communities even exist and thrive suggests that Robert's influence extends far beyond Key West, creating a worldwide network of believers and victims. The apology letters sent to Robert provide a unique window into the psychology of his victims and the specific ways his curse manifests. These documents, numbering in the thousands, represent one of the largest collections of supernatural testimonials ever assembled, and they reveal patterns that are both disturbing and illuminating. The letters fall into several categories, each revealing different aspects of Robert's modus operandi. There are the immediate punishment letters where misfortune strikes within hours or days of the disrespect. These tend to involve sudden illnesses, accidents, mechanical failures that seem to get the victim's attention quickly and dramatically. Then there are the escalating campaign letters. This is where Robert's revenge unfolds over weeks or months, building in intensity until the victim finally makes the connection and writes the apology. These cases often involve a series of increasingly serious problems, minor accidents leading to major ones, financial setbacks growing into significant losses, relationship tensions escalating into breakups or divorces. The most chilling category consists of preemptive strike letters, where Robert seems to punish people before they even have a chance to disrespect him. Well, ain't he clever? These cases suggest that Robert can somehow sense hostile intentions or skeptical attitudes, or maybe they were looking at his pictures online when they were planning the trip and he felt their disrespect. So Robert can somehow sense this, and he strikes first to establish his dominance and discourage challenges to his authority. And the further I get into this story, the bigger my grain of salt needs to be. What's particularly striking about these letters is their tone. They're not written by people seeking attention or trying to perpetuate a hoax. They're written by genuinely frightened individuals who are desperate to make amends and restore normalcy to their lives. The level of detail in these accounts, the specific timelines and correlations they provide, and the obvious relief expressed when the curse is lifted all point to genuine experience rather than fabricated stories. The employees at the Fort East Martello Museum occupy a unique position in the supernatural world. They're essentially a full-time caretaker of a documented malevolent entity. Their daily routines involve not just maintaining an exhibit, but managing an active supernatural presence that continues to influence events around the globe. The staff's relationship with Robert is complex and carefully managed. They treat him with the respect his rules demand, but they also maintain a professional distance that suggests they understand exactly what they're dealing with. They read the apology letters aloud in his presence, not because they necessarily believe it will help, but because the alternative of ignoring the pleas of his victims is just a little too risky. Corey Convertito, the current curator, that's a tongue twister, has become something of an expert on Robert's history and behavior. Her academic approach to documenting his activities provides a valuable counterbalance to the more sensational aspects of his history. She treats Robert as both a historical artifact and an active phenomenon, acknowledging the reality of experience people report, while maintaining the scholarly objectivity necessary to study such an unusual object. The museum's decision to maintain Robert's exhibit, despite the obvious risk, speaks to the complex relationship between tourism, history, and the supernatural. Robert draws thousands of visitors to Key West each year, generating a significant revenue for the museum and the local economy. But this commercial success comes with a price. The museum has essentially become complicit in Robert's ongoing campaign of revenge, providing him with a steady stream of potential victims while profiting from his notoriety. Robert's documented reign of terror has created a sharp divide between skeptics who dismiss the entire phenomenon as mass hysteria and believers who accept the evidence of the supernatural activity. But what's interesting is how many skeptics become believers after their own encounter with Robert, suggesting that direct experience trumps intellectual skepticism when it comes to supernatural phenomenon. The skeptical position is understandable and rational. From a scientific perspective, there is no mechanism by which a doll could cause car accidents, job losses, or illness. The correlation between disrespecting Robert and the subsequent misfortune could be explained by confirmation bias, selective memory, or the psychological stress of believing oneself to be cursed. The fact that apology letters seem to end the curse would be attributed to the placebo effect or the natural tendency for bad luck to eventually improve. But the skeptical position struggles to explain the consistency and specificity of the reports. If this were simply mass hysteria or confirmation bias, you'd expect to see more variation in the types of misfortunes reported and the timelines involved. Instead, the patterns are remarkably consistent across different cultures, age groups, and levels of prior belief in the supernatural. The believer position, well, less scientifically rigorous, has the advantage of taking the reported experience at face value. If thousands of people report similar patterns of misfortune following specific interactions with Robert, and if these patterns consistently resolve after formal apologies are made, then perhaps the simplest explanation is that Robert actually possesses some form of supernatural power. What's the most compelling about the believer position is how many former skeptics it includes. These people who visited Robert with the intention of debunking his legend, only to find themselves writing apology letters after experiencing the very real phenomena they set out to disprove. Their testimonials carry particular weight because they represent conversations based on direct experience rather than pre-existing belief. So, Robert the doll represents more than supernatural curiosity. He's a lens through which we can examine our relationship with fear, respect, and the unknown. His century-long reign of terror reveals something fundamental about human nature and our need to find meaning in chaos. On one level, Robert serves as a powerful reminder that actions have consequences, even when those consequences seem disproportionate or supernatural. The strict protocol required to visit him safely creates a framework for respectful behavior that extends beyond the supernatural realm. In a world where disrespect and mockery are often consequence-free, Robert represents a return to a more dangerous time when showing proper deference wasn't just polite, it was necessary for survival. Robert also embodies our deepest fears about powerlessness and unpredictability. The people who write apology letters aren't just afraid of a doll, they're afraid of forces beyond their control, of consequences they can't predict or prevent. In an age of scientific rationalism and technological control, Robert represents the persistence of mystery and the limits of human understanding. The global nature of Robert's influence in a digital age raises questions about how traditional supernatural beliefs adapt to modern technology. If a cursed doll from Key West can affect people around the world through photographs and videos, what does that say about the relationship between the physical and digital reality? We are witnessing the evolution of supernatural phenomenon, or have these forces always operated beyond the boundaries that we thought contained them? As Robert enters his second century of documented supernatural activity, there's no sign that his power is diminishing. If anything, his influence is growing, aided by social media, global tourism, and the museum's careful documentation of his activities. The question isn't whether Robert will continue to terrorize people, it's how his methods will evolve to meet the challenges of an increasingly connected and skeptical world. The digital dimension of Robert's power suggests that he's already adapting to new forms of media and communication. As virtual reality has augmented reality technologies become more prevalent, will Robert find new ways to reach potential victims? Will his image in a VR museum exhibit carry the same as his physical presence? These questions may seem absurd, but they're logical extensions of the patterns we've already seen. There's also the question of what happens to Robert when his physical form finally deteriorates beyond repair. He's already over a century old, and despite the museum's careful preservation efforts, he won't last forever. Will his power transfer to a new vessel, or will it dissipate when his original form is finally destroyed? The precedent set by his transfer from the Otto family to Myrtle Router suggests that the curse isn't dependent on his original context. But we don't know. We just don't know until we're faced with that situation what it'll be. The museum's role in Robert's future is particularly important. As long as they continue to maintain his exhibit and read apology letters out loud in his presence, they're actively participating in his activities. But what would happen if they decided to stop? Would Robert's power fade without institutional support, or would he find new ways to make his presence known? After examining over a century of documented supernatural activity, the evidence points to an inescapable conclusion. Robert the Doll possesses some form of malevolent consciousness that operates according to its own rules and agenda. Whether this consciousness originated from a voodoo curse, the lingering spirit of Jean Otto, or some other unknown force is ultimately less important than the consistent pattern of targeted misfortune that follows every act of disrespect. The thousands of apology letters that surround Robert's exhibit aren't just testimonials to his power. They're proof in an age of scientific skepticism and rational thinking that these are still forces that operate beyond our understanding and control. Robert represents the persistence of mystery in a world that believes it has explained every damn thing. The survival of fear in a culture that prides itself on fearlessness. His glass case at the Fort East Martello Museum isn't just a display, it's his throne room, the seat of power for a malevolent entity whose kingdom spans the globe and plans to subjugate in the thousands. The protocol required to visit him isn't just museum policy, it's a recognition of his sovereignty, an acknowledgement that some powers demand respect regardless of whether we understand them or not. One of the more chilling aspects of Robert's reign isn't the supernatural phenomenon he allegedly causes. It's the cold, calculating intelligence behind his actions. He doesn't lash out randomly or indiscriminately. He waits, he watches, he remembers, and he strikes with surgical precision at exactly the right moment to maximize impact and minimize doubt about the source of the victim's misfortune. This isn't the behavior of a mindless curse or a random supernatural force. This is the behavior of a conscious entity with its own agenda and an infinite capacity for patience. As visitors continue to flock to Key West and see Robert in his glass case, they're not just viewing a museum exhibit, they're entering the court of a malevolent monarch whose power has been growing for over a century. The rules are simple. Show respect, ask permission, say thank you, and maybe, just maybe, you'll leave with your life intact. But remember, Robert has been watching and waiting for over 100 years, and he's got nothing but time. The question isn't whether you believe in Robert's power, it's whether you're willing to risk finding out the hard way that his kingdom is very real, very unforgiving, and always accepting new subjects. So, when you visit, remember to be polite. Your life just may depend on it. Or not. After my snarky remarks, we'll see what happens to me. Let's see if Robert makes the connection between this episode and maybe dealing me some trouble. But that's where I can leave it. That's me for this time. Sweet dreams, y'all. See you next time.